Are you ready to work on Evening in Bloom? Let's get started. At this point, you have set up your embroidery hoop, you understand the basic principles and how-tos of punch needle embroidery, and familiarized yourself with this pattern. If you are not comfortable with any of these steps, come back to this video after you have watched our other video tutorials covering the basics. Since we are starting with a lighter colored yarn, I suggest first threading the punch needle with the navy yarn to clean out any residue inside of the punch needle shaft. If threading a punch needle is new to you, take a minute to walk through our quick tutorial. After doing that, let's thread the punch needle with the yellow yarn. Links for all of these tutorials are down below. Now let's get started with the pattern. We are going to begin with the top narrow stitch to complete the centers of each daisy. Using the pointed tip of the punch needle, punch the fabric at the center of the circle as far as your needle will go. Flip your project over and pull the tail of the yarn through, leaving a couple of inches on the back side of the fabric. Turn the project back over and pull the punch needle out of the hole you just made. With the tip of the needle still touching the monk's cloth, draw the needle forward about 2 squares. Once again, punch the fabric. Now, before pulling it back up, rotate it to point in the direction of your next stitch. Draw the tip of the needle forward about 2 squares and punch again. Continue this sequence, punching short, tight stitches in a circle around the first stitch you created. Proceed with filling the daisy center with stitches. Place each new stitch as closely as possible to the stitch from the previous round. When you are completing your last stitch, do not pull the needle back through the fabric. Flip the project over, pull the yarn through the punch needle shaft, and cut the yarn with your scissors. Now pull the punch needle back through the fabric. Complete the centers of the other 2 daisies in the exact same way. Once all 3 daisy petals are completed, you are ready to move on to step 2. To begin step 2, punch a hole in the center of the petal. Working from the center outward, create a star pattern using the satin stitch inside the pink petunias. Work each leg in long stitches up and back down to the center. The satin stitch is an elegant stitch that creates a smooth looking pattern. When working this stitch, return to the point of the last stitch as closely as you can so that each satin stitch is right next to the last stitch. If you punch your hole too far away from the previous stitch's starting point, you will create gaps that will have to be filled in later. Complete each petal, finishing back in the center where you started. Trim the yarn and complete the other 2 petunia petals. Next, we are going to complete the hydrangeas. First the blossoms using the needle wrap stitch, and then the stems using the faux chain stitch or variation. For the hydrangea blooms, we are going to work in the same circular pattern that we did for step 1. Poke your hole in the center of the circle, bring the punch needle back up, and then rotate the punch needle so that you create a loop. Turn your punch needle in a complete circle, and then punch the fabric. Pull the needle up a little bit this time because you are going to punch the next hole over the loop of the last stitch you made. You may want to hold on to the back of the yarn if your yarn has gotten a little frayed and doesn't glide through the needle as smoothly. You will also want to play with the amount of slack you use. This stitch is a little bit like twirling a fork with spaghetti on it. Continue working the hydrangea from the center outward until you are ready to complete your last stitch. As you pull the punch needle back up to complete the previous stitch, do not turn the needle this time. Lift the needle over the last loop and complete a top narrow stitch to finish the flower and lock it into place. Finish each of the hydrangea blooms in this same manner. Next is the hydrangea stems. Each stem is completed using 2 rows, 1 row up and 1 row back down to the starting point. Start at the bottom of a branch and complete a basic top stitch. The top stitch is the same as the top narrow stitch, but instead of punching every 2 holes in the monk's cloth, you are going to create longer stitches, punching about every 4 holes in the monk's cloth. Continue punching in the same direction until you reach a branch or the flower blossom. Now that I've reached this branch, I continue working up until I hit the flower bloom. Then I turn my needle around and continue punching right back to the main branch. And then I continue right back up the next branch to the blossom, turn around and come back. On the return pass, aim to punch in the same hole that you created on the first pass. This is what creates the chain look. Continue down until you hit the next branch. Work this branch in the exact same way you did the last one. Stitch up to the bloom, turn around, and stitch back in the same holes that you created on the first pass. Finish the branch by punching back to the hole in which you started. Here is an alternate option for stitching the branches. The first pass up the branch is the same, but rather than aiming for the same hole on the return pass, punch in the middle of each stitch. This creates more of a braided look. Try both methods and see which one you like better, or use both of them. Once you have completed the hydrangea blooms and stems, you're ready for step 4. Next, we are going to complete the petals of the daisies and the petunia stitches. We are going to use the same satin stitch that we used in step 2. This time, however, we are going to create longer stitches. Start close to the center of the flower and make long stitches up to the top of the petal. Return back to the stitch in the center. Sometimes you may have to hold on to the yarn on the back side of the monk's cloth to keep it in place. That's okay. It just happens when the yarn becomes frayed and doesn't slide as nicely through the punch needle. Work each petal of each daisy in the same satin stitch. Once you have finished each of your daisies, you can move on to finishing the petals of the petunias using the same satin stitch. By now, I assume you're an expert on the satin stitch. And I presume that your petunia petals are probably perfect. The final step of this pattern is to complete the background with the navy yarn. Working from the outside toward the center, use the top stitch to fill in the navy background and complete the pattern. There is no one way to do this. You can work small sections at a time if you would like, or work in full circles, which is what I find myself doing on this pattern. The main thing to keep an eye on is that you are keeping your stitches really close together. You don't want the monk's cloth to show through. If you do find that you have a gap that annoys you, you can always come back and add a stitch or two later. Another little tip is to go ahead and cut your yarn every few minutes. That way, if a stitch comes undone, you won't have to pull too much out to get back to it. That's it, you've completed the pattern Evening in Bloom. I hope you enjoyed working on it.